My name is Richard Clay, and I'm the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to the Filson's Juneteenth production. This is the first of our Filson Fridays, and I'm delighted that it has fallen on this particular and important and meaningful date. We had originally scheduled a presentation by me on a Lexington emancipationist named Madison C. Johnson. But we decided rather than to dive into the particular, it would be better because of the significance of this date to cover the general topic of emancipation in Kentucky. And that is why we made the rather quick change this time yesterday. I can assure you, you're going to have a great time today listening to my colleague, Patrick Lewis. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrick Lewis. Patrick is the scholar in residence at the Filson Historical Society. He's a native of Trigg County, and he graduated from Transylvania University, and he holds a PhD in history from the University of Kentucky. He has worked for the National Park Service and Kentucky Historical Society, and he's won digital history grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Patrick is the author of For Slavery and Union, Benjamin Buckner and Kentucky Loyalties in the Civil War. I am now pleased to turn this over to Patrick Lewis for his presentation.
Thanks a lot, Dick. And again, thank you everybody for joining us on incredibly short notice. I feel like the national conversation around Juneteenth has reached a whole new level of importance and intensity this year. And I was seeing in some of my conversations in social media and around that, you know, there were questions about what Juneteenth means, and specifically what that means for Kentucky. And this happens to be something that I've given a great deal of thought about as a historian and also as a Kentuckian. Trying to think through my own experiences with race and the legacies of slavery in our state growing up. So I'm going to keep this very informal and hope that you all will put your questions into the chat, like Dick said, and then he'll go through and pose them to me, and hopefully we get everybody's sort of the whole topic covered. With that having been said, I want to just generally overview and say, you know, the thing that you may have been reading about Juneteenth in the national media is it is this moment in the summer of 1865 when a U.S. Army officer, Gordon Granger, goes down to Galveston and reads essentially the text of the Emancipation Proclamation to a group of people who had been enslaved in Texas and had not known that the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed. So they had, you know, been free essentially for months and years by that point, but did not know it. And this really reminds us that the process of emancipation during the Civil War is something that happened in different communities and different parts of states at different times. And freedom never flipped a switch on and existed across the land. And in fact, as we know from anyone who's studied Reconstruction and the century of history that followed the Civil War, that freedom is always contested and always rolling out and evolving over time. And so the same situation is true in Kentucky. Being a Union state and a slave state, if any of you are on with my presentation a couple of weeks ago on my book about Ben Buckner, we dove into the politics of why Kentucky was a Union state and a slave state and what that meant politically for white people who are in political power, but African Americans in the state experienced this as well. And so this means that to keep Kentucky on the side of the Union, President Lincoln is incredibly hesitant to touch slavery in Kentucky. And he only does so as enslaved people, as African-American people in this state, leave the places where they had been enslaved, demand to be enlisted into the armies, and sort of pressure the United States Army and the Lincoln administration to take greater steps to achieve their freedom. Ultimately and legally, that does not come until December of 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Kentucky is by that point, and somebody's lampooning us in Congress at the time and saying there are 3 slave nations in the world at this point: Cuba, Brazil, and Kentucky, and they're not wrong. The laws of this land were still enforced, and courts and law enforcement officials were continuing to try and enforce the laws of slavery, even as they were just trying to mop up the ocean as the tide of freedom was rolling over the state. But it doesn't officially come until December of 1865. So we're thinking now a full 6 months after Juneteenth does freedom finally come into Kentucky. But there are a number of dates that we could look at as potentially other Kentucky Juneteenths. And we can get into those in a little bit. Does anybody have any questions first off before we go in to me just talking for a long time and y'all gonna get bored?
Patrick, there are none in the chat room right now.
All right. So thinking about potential other dates for what is Kentucky's Juneteenth, we can start to look back to some of the ways that freedom was starting to come in Kentucky. Obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation very famously does not apply here. Again, as I was saying, Abraham Lincoln is incredibly hesitant to push Kentucky politicians, conservative, slave-owning, unionist politicians in this state, with any moves against slavery. And the Emancipation Proclamation, as it's rolled out in September of 1862, is designed to end the rebellion and scare the Confederate states into coming back into the Union. He says very simply, we will free the slaves in the states currently in rebellion. So the Confederate states proper. Kentucky was in the Confederate government, but well, that's another topic. Confederate states proper. If you don't quit fighting and join the Union, and there is some hope, some outside chance that some upper South states, maybe a Tennessee, maybe a North Carolina, maybe a Virginia, maybe a West Virginia, well, West Virginia is excluded anyway, will say, yeah, you know what, this whole rebellion thing isn't for us. We'd rather keep slavery, and they would come back in. And so Lincoln gives them a period of time until January 1st, 1863, to come back into the fold. And of course, nobody does. But this executive order, which is essentially authorizing the U.S. Army to carry freedom with it as U.S. armies proceed down into the South, down into Virginia, down into Tennessee and Georgia, down the Mississippi River Valley, does not apply to Kentucky. And the second thing that starts happening after the 1st of January, 1863, is the new provision for the enlistment of Black men into the U.S. Army. And this happens again in places in the Deep South, in South Carolina and in Louisiana and Mississippi, where the U.S. Army already was, where there was a large pre-existing antebellum Black population there, where slavery had essentially collapsed. And Black men start to join the Union Army in the spring of 1863. And this thought absolutely terrifies white Kentucky politicians. And so Kentucky essentially negotiates itself an exemption to where enslaved men in Kentucky will not be recruited into the U.S. Army. And that seems to sort of tamp things down through the end of 1863. By the winter of 1862, 1863, or 1863-64, forgive me, Black men in Kentucky are streaming outside of the state, right? So thinking about all the borders that we touch, into Tennessee, across into to Indiana and Ohio and Illinois. African-American men are going to U.S. Army posts, fleeing the places where they had been enslaved, and enlisting in United States colored troop regiments in those states. And at this point, Kentucky politicians start to pay attention because there is a national draft. Each state has been assigned a quota. The Civil War has become incredibly unpopular among white Kentuckians who do not like this shift in the objectives of the war from a war for Union to a war against slavery. And so white recruitment in this state has all but dried up. And you know, rather than having local sheriffs go out and enforce the draft in county after county, Kentucky politicians start to recognize that men who had been enslaved in Kentucky are going to Tennessee, and Tennessee is getting credit for those enlistments, and Kentucky isn't. And so by the end of February 1864, they don't exactly like it, but white Kentuckians will acquiesce to Black Kentuckians enlisting in the U.S. Army. And so that continues on throughout 1864. The summer of 1864 sees what we think of as kind of the quintessential, enlistment place for African Americans in this state at Camp Nelson, which is now going in the process of becoming a national park, which is fantastic. But other places as well: Louisville, Paducah, Bowling Green. All of these places are seeing Black enlistments there, and that starts essentially to bleed slavery dry in this state throughout the summer of '64. Of course, the election that happens in 1864, the presidential election in November, is incredibly contentious. Some incredibly heated and racist rhetoric is thrown around in Kentucky polling places. A number of the lieutenant governor of the state is briefly jailed and exiled to the Confederacy. A Louisvillian named Richard T. Jacob, kicked out of the state for decrying the Lincoln administration in terms that were deemed treasonous. A number of other state legislators are also arrested. It gets quite nasty here. But as 1865 dawns, there's this growing recognition that slavery is increasingly untenable in Kentucky, and though they can kind of cling to the corpse, there really is kind of slave owners in Kentucky are trying to play an end game. A lot of them are playing for some sort of compensated emancipation scheme. They're trying to hold out hope that the Lincoln administration will essentially set some rate that will compensate owners of slaves for their freedom at $300 or $500 a piece, depending on age and sex. There are various formula thrown around, which is incredibly disturbing to think about government bureaucrats trying to set that sort of blanket rate, but there you are. That, of course, never comes to fruition either. And then the war ends essentially in April. The Confederacy sort of falls apart. Of course, Lincoln is unfortunately assassinated, and this kind of snaps a bunch of Kentuckians who had been eagerly dipping in their toes into the treasonous rhetoric of anti-Lincolnism. They kind of get a wake-up call and enter this period of mourning. And then after Lincoln's assassination, the conversation shifts in Kentucky for the most part into recognizing that slavery was going to end, but trying then to find the kind of the best way forward. And this is where the state's sort of small antebellum emancipationist movement, and we mentioned Madison Johnson, who is a part of that, but sort of figureheaded by Cassius Clay and the Reverend R.J. Breckinridge, kind of comes in there, and they start to kind of imagine a South without slavery, and they start to put things in. As it happens, essentially the state legislature in the session that spans 1865-66 just kind of in a lot of ways strikes out the word slave and inserts the word Negro in all of the laws, and not much of the lived experience changes for Black people. there is a massive population movement, and we can talk a lot about this in questions if people want to know about it. One of the great themes in Black life after the Civil War is travel, and trying primarily to link up family. You think about Kentucky, which had been a net exporter of human beings during the last couple of decades before the Civil War. You know, there are Black families which are scattered from Kentucky to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, and the chaos of the war, and men have gone to armies, and women and children have gone to so-called contraband camps to find shelter and food and education, and everybody's trying to link back up together, and especially around military camps like Camp Nelson, around cities like Louisville. There are these sort of huge transient refugee populations kind of living on the outskirts, picking up day labor where they can, trying to survive. There is this, as there so often is in times of conflict, we see this, I think especially most recently, probably around Syria and the Civil War there, these huge humanitarian crises, public health crises, people dying from starvation and disease in these shanty towns, these refugee camps, whatever they are, almost without number. We do not have a good understanding of how many Black people die in the South immediately following the war, but all we can guess is it's absolutely horrific as they try and seek freedom from a federal government which has just finished fighting this bloody and expensive war, and quite honestly wants to demobilize this army as quickly as possible and wrap this thing up and everybody get back on with their lives. And so the aid and assistance that's out there is not what it needs to be. So I see we've got a couple of questions in there. So Dick, you want to pick one for us?
Patrick, we have one from Adam. And the question is, was there a surge in Confederate enlistments from Kentucky following the Emancipation Proclamation?
God, that's a really fantastic question. The Confederates sure hope there will be. And in Kentucky, the timing of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation links up with the Confederate invasion of the state that will ultimately lead to the Battle of Perryville. And so the Confederate Army under Braxton Bragg, it moves up into Kentucky in the summer of 1862, is bringing with it wagons and wagons of rifles, expecting that these Kentuckians will have seen the error of their ways, that they will have finally got fed up of palling around with Yankees and this Lincoln administration, and that they will find their true home in the Southern Confederacy. Of course, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation had been preceded by what was known as the Confiscation Acts, which allowed the United States Army to seize enslaved men and women as property of the Confederate States of America, material that was being used to wage war against the United States Army. And so by an argument of military necessity, just in the same way as you could seize guns, you could seize horses, you could seize people as well and liberate them. And so the Confederates don't know the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is on the way as they're marching up into Kentucky. It's a happy coincidence for them. But you better believe that those generals and those politicians that are following in the wake of that Confederate Army, as they stop in every small town on the road north into Kentucky, they get out and they beat the bush and they remind those citizens precisely of the stakes of this war now. And they remind Kentuckians that Lincoln is out here to end slavery now, and the mask is off. It does not see, at least in that summer, the same sort of response that they're hoping for. A lot of those guns travel right back south with them in those wagons. John Hunt Morgan does do a good job of recruiting some cavalry in the Bluegrass area in that summer. That's where he really expands his command from a regiment to brigade, and then he tacks on some guys from other states and he gets division size. but they're about the only ones that rally to the cause. So there are in the central bluegrass some young men, generally of very good families, who join the cavalry and ride off with Morgan, of course, only to be captured a year later and spend the majority of the war in prison camps. What then Emancipation does do, though, is it intensifies the guerrilla conflict in Kentucky. And that's something that we are just now beginning to wrestle with from a military history perspective. But more or less, and it's both the Emancipation Proclamation, but then also the recruitment of Black men into the Army absolutely incenses white Kentuckians. And so the guerrilla bands we now tend to understand are a mixture of Confederate soldiers who have been sent back to recruit guerrilla cells in Kentucky, and then disaffected local people who had not joined one army or the other, but for whom Black recruitment into the U.S. Army is a step too far. And then they go out and they start both attacking U.S. military posts, but then also just attacking the general population. And that chaos spreads in 64 and 65.
A question that will perhaps give some context. Can you talk to people about the ill-starred Confederate state of Kentucky?
Yeah. So the Confederate cause in Kentucky never has majority support. At most, by the end of 1865, there is probably a majority of Kentuckians who are anti-Lincoln, who are anti-Union, but that doesn't mean they're pro-Confederate. That's a kind of a different marker that not everybody in the state gets to. Best we can guess, and this is estimating on things like military enlistments and voting patterns and other sorts of things, about a third of the state are out and out Confederate supporters. And in the summer of 1861, sort of after the firing of Fort Sumter and when war is being declared, when the rest of the Upper South is sort of mobilizing and debating this question of secession, and secession conventions are called in places like Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina. Kentucky also considers this question, does not call a formal convention, but has instead a series of elections in August that both elect a new legislature and then a congressional delegation. Those elections are overwhelmingly won by Unionists, though it should be said that a number of Confederates thought that they were rigged from the outset and refused to vote, which just get out and vote, people. You got to make your voices heard. And so these resounding Unionist victories lead then to a secession convention that establishes itself in the southern part of the state, eventually with its capital to be at Bowling Green. They elect a provisional governor named George W. Johnson, Madison Johnson's brother, who is a planter from Scott County, who is also deeply, deeply invested in cotton plantations in Mississippi and Arkansas. And this provisional Confederate government tries to raise money. It also robs some banks. It tries to raise troops. It does send a congressional delegation to the new Confederate Congress that gathers ultimately in Richmond. And it is hoping that with a Confederate victory, military victory that seizes control of the state at some future point, then it could establish itself as the legitimate government. That never happens. The Confederate government does govern in this southern tier of counties. So you can imagine pretty much anything that touches the Tennessee border was governed by this Confederate government through the winter of 1861-62, but with sort of twin disasters at Mill Springs over on the east and at Fort Donelson in the west, they fall back and they never sort of wield power in the state again, though they're always a threat to come back. And it makes Union politicians in the state incredibly paranoid to know that there is this shadow government that will come in and does try and take Frankfort on a couple of occasions.
This is from Larry Sloan. Were there any Kentucky slave owners who, upon seeing slavery's collapse in the state, freed their slaves? And if so, then what choices did the former slaves have? Staying with their former employer or owner as a sharecropper or paid laborer, or dispersing?
Yeah, that's basically the two sets of choices that most of them see. There is this great concern that Kentucky not do anything, right? And so we talked about this massive shift that happens after the assassination of Lincoln, where the conversation in the state starts to shift towards, now how do we sort of deconstruct slavery in a way that is not economically damaging to the state. And one of those primary concerns is, look, we have crop in the ground, and we've got to get that thing harvested. And so one of the reasons that Kentucky slave owners are going to fight so hard to cling to slavery until the last possible moment on December probably 6th or 7th, 1865, is because they want to make sure they're well through that harvest season. But no, there is this huge market for essentially sharecropping. Yeah, is it certainly pops up, but then also there are just free people who decide to go kind of strike out on their own, and so they'll essentially we would call it migrant labor today, trying to pick up work as they follow different crop harvests and rotations around. There have also been some pretty huge internal movements of the sort of centers of slavery during the war. I've seen some evidence of a big kind of micro boom in tobacco counties in Western Kentucky, thinking like Owensboro, Henderson kind of places, that are buying slaves from the bluegrass in 1863 and 1864 as the market for slaves kind of bottoms out in central Kentucky and prices are very low. The Western Kentucky tobacco counties are, you think about it, it's kind of fascinating, are in a really good market position because the rest of the tobacco producing states in the South are in the Confederacy now. And Union soldiers want a dip. So if tobacco is to be grown, it's to come from Western Kentucky. And so they have this huge demand for labor. And so there have already been some big movements in there. And as those leases or rentals or sales or whatever all fall apart, then there's this open sort of pool of labor. A lot of Black people end up going to cities. And that's really where we see the largest growth. And then also military camps, right? So Kentucky leads the nation right up there with Louisiana with the number of Black men who enlist from the state, because in Kentucky, that's the only guaranteed path to freedom. First, it's a path to freedom for the man who enlists, and then later, the federal government will guarantee the freedom of his wife and children as well. So even though there is slavery technically on the ground, if you can have a military enlistment and have a direct connection to that, then that's your path to freedom. And so those men stay in the Army until 1866 or 1867. And their families eventually, not at first, but eventually are also being fed and clothed and housed in military camps too. So that for a little while, then sort of answers the question for a lot of people, for a lot of Black people, about survival, immediate survival. And the Army is immediate survival.
This is an interesting question that goes to the issue of collections, be it at the Filson or the Kentucky Historical Society, and it is from Katie Algio. I've been trying to track the story of William Garvin, who in February 1865 left the Hart County farm down near Hodgenville, where he'd been enslaved, and enlisted in the 12th Colored Heavy Artillery in Bowling Green. Do you know of any personal narratives that relate to this kind of experience by African-American men from Kentucky?
Yeah, they're primarily in memoir. Elijah Mars is probably the most famous, who will become a minister and educational advocate later on in the war, and he'll write a really fantastic memoir of his time enlisted. I want to say he's a heavy artillery regiment. He might be the 12th.
Is he a Kentuckian?
He is a Kentuckian, yeah. There are also some good letter collections, in as much as they exist. They are pretty rare. Some good letter collections have been published in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. Those are quite valuable. Those are now available electronically on JSTOR, and that's free and open access through the end of the year right now, so you can find them there. In general, the question of African-American collections, especially at this moment, is incredibly sad and difficult, because they have essentially been forced into illiteracy by the institution of slavery. One of the big initiatives that the Army wants to see happen, and that charitable organizations want to see happen, is literacy and education. And so, you know, alongside these military bureaucracies that pop up in places like Camp Nelson, you'll also see then this charitable side of things, where sort of non-government organizations, as we would call them today, come in and provide medical care and basic education for all ages of people. And John G. Fees, the founder of Berea, had been run out of the state right before the Civil War for his very radical abolitionist and egalitarian views, comes back, and he's kind of the anchor of that educational community that happens there in Camp Nelson, and then transfers that pretty soon on into Berea. That having been said, though, you know, we don't have much in the voices of the enslaved. The best places to go and look for that are the National Archives, and the Freedmen's Bureau, very, very fortunately, was established and did operate in Kentucky for about 5 years. And it collects a huge number of stories of enslaved people and freed people as they try and navigate their way. And so there's a project at the University of Maryland that produces a series called Freedom, a documentary history. And they have combed the National Archives and the Freedmen's Bureau records for really fantastic documents, letters, labor contracts, you name it, from Black people, not only in Kentucky, but from across the state. And you can they have usually thematic volumes, so there'll be one about the military, there'll be one about economics, there'll be one about politics, et cetera. And then each state will have a chapter. So I would certainly recommend going and looking at those. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg of what exists in the National Archives. But as far as what exists here in the state, it's pretty slim.
Here's another one that goes to Camp Nelson in general. And it certainly was a camp for African Americans to come and then be recruited into the U.S. Army. But the question is that family members and perhaps other enslaved people in Kentucky went to Camp Nelson or were taken there. So what can you tell us about that camp? And then additionally, were people expelled at some point from Camp Nelson, and did deaths arise from that expulsion?
Very famously, yes. So there's a fantastic new book that I absolutely have to plug called Embattled Freedom. It's on my shelf back here behind me. I would go pull it, but it's by Amy Taylor, who is a professor at UK and who is absolutely wonderful historian that we're lucky to have in the state. And she published that last year. It swept all of the Civil War book awards. It is an absolutely magnificent work, and it focuses on this process of emancipation, what happens in the so-called contraband camps, but framing this as in the lens now that we have of a modern refugee crisis that follows a civil war. And so she looks at Camp Nelson in great detail, along with some other sites, particularly in South Carolina and Arkansas. And so I would recommend that anyone go and pick up a copy of that book. It's wonderful. So Camp Nelson is a place where at first, you know, there's this, rumors are very important in the Civil War, in the absence of much media at all, and the media that does exist is controlled by white newspaper editors who want to see slavery preserved. As people start to hear that there might be a path to freedom through the U.S. Army, then places like Camp Nelson, and again, we've talked about Bowling Green already, and Paducah, Fort Donelson, just across the state line in Tennessee, become these sort of magnets. And if people can escape and can get away and can get off the farms where they had been enslaved, they do, and they go there. And eventually it becomes pretty well known that men of military age can enlist in the Army and find freedom there. And they also bring their families because they don't want to escape and leave a family at home on the plantation to face the retribution of a very angry owner. And this is very frequently attested. The wives and the children of men who flee to go enlist in the U.S. Army are beaten and killed back at home as punishment. And so whole families start migrating at once in the summer of 1864. And by the winter there, the U.S. Army logistically is overwhelmed by they can't feed all of these people, and so in an incredibly misguided order, the commandant of the camp ejects all of the families of the USCT soldiers from Camp Nelson. He says, "You have no reason to be here. You have no legal thing to do here on this Army base. Go." And so they all start walking essentially in the middle of the night up towards Nicholasville. And if any of y'all have driven that road between Nicholasville and Danville, you kind of know exactly where I'm talking about. And as it is in Kentucky, rain turns into an ice storm. And imagine the severity of that. People who are scantily clothed, who escaped to this camp with the clothes on their back, probably having come maybe even in the summer, and it is just a disaster. And hundreds upon hundreds of women and children die on this march up to Nicholasville, and it makes national headlines, and the U.S. Army is absolutely humiliated by this. And so fortunately then that leads to the passage of a law that says that the wives and children of men who enlist in the U.S. Army are themselves free and can stay on the post and receive food and receive medical care and receive shelter, but that came at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of lives.
For those of you who have entered recently, there is a chat feature on your screen, so that if you're, we've had a very short lecture part, and now the lecture is an evolving wonder in response to the questions that I'm getting on the chat screen. So if you have a question, feel free to enter it on the chat screen, and we'll do our best to get to it. Now, here is one, Patrick, that I think is interesting, and this is Kentucky communities continued supporting the slave trade within the state during the Civil War. How did the Union Army deal with that?
Not much at all, because this is the United States Army. It is here to enforce the existing laws of the Republic and of the state in which they exist. And so they do very little to interfere with the slave trade. There is one really interesting example that I've seen, a counterexample of that from Louisville, actually. So in the summer and fall of 1862, when the Confederates invade, and this comes right at, as we've already discussed, but for everybody's joined, comes on the heels of the First and Second Contraband Acts, or Confiscation Acts, which declares enslaved people owned by Confederates to be property of war, and they can be seized. So this essentially is sort of a loophole that the U.S. Army is using to end slavery wherever it is. And so the U.S. Army has been operating in Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee. And so as it chases that Confederate Army back up into Kentucky, walking along behind the U.S. Army on this road north are a few thousand people who have self-liberated. And they start to make their way north, not really knowing where to go, but only that the Union Army is the only thing that keeps them free and keeps them safe-ish. And then as they come into Kentucky and the Army starts to maneuver against the Confederates, and this column of self-emancipated people kind of breaks off and starts heading generally towards Louisville. And this is kind of the first time that Louisville sees this massive refugee influx. And so now we're talking about sometime in September or October 1862, right around the time of the Battle of Perryville. Well, local authorities in Kentucky, all the way up from the southern border of the state all the way to Louisville. So essentially thinking about, I don't know, a 20 or 30 mile swath either side of I-65 as they move north. See this as an absolute horror. There are thousands upon thousands of Black people who are not under the control of masters and who could spread dangerous ideas of freedom into people who were enslaved in Kentucky. And so they start to arrest and capture as many of these people as they can. And so the jails from Bowling Green up to Louisville are absolutely crammed with people who had fled slavery in Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi. And so they continue to follow the fugitive slave law as it existed in Kentucky and nationally. And so these sheriffs and these, usually sheriffs, and these county courts will do what they're supposed to do. They advertise in local and regional newspapers and say, I have captured the following enslaved people. They don't say enslaved people. And name, says he is owned by person, from, place. And there's just lists of them, and they publish them in the newspaper. And they're required to publish those with the understanding that the owner in times not war would come up and claim that slave. And then if they have advertised that for a sufficient amount of time, then they can sell that person on the auction block in those counties for profit. And that profit goes directly into the hands of the sheriff and the county court officers.
During the Civil War, was the Underground Railroad in Kentucky still active? Was the conflict so disruptive that the railroad ceased to exist? Yeah,
the Underground Railroad in Kentucky is really Black run, and is this series of sort of known stops, and it's not sort of white abolitionists, having house hideout kind of things. The Louisville free Black community is very, very important. The community here of free people who are professionals, sort of barbers, blacksmiths, people with skilled trades are incredibly important. And so Louisville is a big conduit for this. This all kinds of breaks down in the chaos of the war because there are new avenues to freedom coming to you. Right, and this is the difference. Freedom is not across the Ohio River. The Union Army is freedom. And if you can follow the Army, then you can find freedom. So what ends up happening, getting back to the question of does the Union Army interfere in slave sales? The sheriff in Jefferson County is just making an absolute killing selling people in the courthouse square and for cut rate prices. And so the U.S. Army steps in and says you have to stop these sales, and the people who have bought these people have to give them back, and you have to let them go because these people were legally freed by the text of the Emancipation Proclamation. They're not from Kentucky; they're from Alabama, and so they are free. Then what happens to those African American people afterwards? We do not know. They kind of disappear into the ether. But that's one of the few times that the U.S. Army interferes. But that's only because those people were from out of state and not from Kentucky. Within Kentucky, U.S. Army officials are told, do not touch slavery. We do not need to anger the Kentuckians.
Was there a national plan of any description that would, for newly freed persons, to help them support themselves? Did anyone in government think about the hundreds or thousands of people who suddenly were freed would support themselves?
Yeah, and the Freedmen's Bureau is created as a new government agency to help that process. It probably has its greatest success in places like Beaufort, South Carolina, where there is land redistribution, there is education, there's kind of everything. They're reimagining a new South, a new post-slavery South, where all people have an equal shot to make it, and that's a radical concept that not everybody, even in government, is quite comfortable with. In Kentucky, the Freedmen's Bureau tries to do the same sorts of things, but it's increasingly hampered by having a slave-owning democratic government in place, right? And unlike places in the rest of the Confederate South, which have Republican governments that come back into power when those states come back into union, and the Union Army is there as an occupying force for, in some places, a decade. The Freedmen's Bureau is able to do some really fantastic work. It's obviously hampered by kind of vigilante violence from the Klan and things like that. But in Kentucky, the Freedmen's Bureau faces organized political opposition from courts and county judges who never had to relinquish power. And in addition to the violent terrorism of the Klan that'll start in 1865 and 66 and ongoing. And not all Kentucky violence is perpetrated in the name of the Klan. There's a number of different sort of terroristic organizations. But suffice it to say, those sorts of things. What the Freedmen's Bureau does very well in Kentucky and has its greatest success at is establishing schools. And Kentucky has one of the most extensive school systems for freed people set up anywhere in the South. And within a couple of years, the majority of the teachers in those schools are Black Kentuckians themselves, and not sort of white missionaries who have come down from the South to sort of do charitable work. Kentucky Black people take that on themselves and have that to them. Unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau is essentially run out of the state pretty soon through the power of the state government complaining to Washington and saying, look, we were a loyal state, you can't impose this upon us. And then after that, sort of the plans that anybody in the Republican Party might have had for setting up free people on a path to prosperity is wrecked. And this is also because Lincoln is dead and Andrew Johnson is a Tennessee slave owner. And the Johnson administration wants absolutely nothing to do with elevating free people.
Here are two questions that we can take together. And that is, we hear so much about slavery in Western Kentucky, Hopkinsville, Henderson, and Central Kentucky around Lexington and the communities within its spokes. But what about the prevalence of enslavement in Eastern Kentucky? There are slaves there. And how did slavery differ according to these vast geographical differences across the Commonwealth?
Yeah, that's a great question. Slavery is less prevalent as a general rule in Eastern Kentucky than it is in other parts of the state. Though it is present essentially everywhere. There are some places, I don't know, Perry County comes to mind, where there are next to no Black people in the 1860 census. But at the same time, the same sorts of sort of proto-industrial development that we'll see really coming into Appalachia in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s around coal and around timber. There are sort of predecessor industries in the mountains, especially around salt, around iron. Some very limited early coal mining is happening as well. And those things are really driven by slavery. So where you see those early industries, you see industrial slavery taking root there. There is not as much an emphasis in Eastern Kentucky on slavery being tied to agriculture. It is a little bit more industrial, which is an interesting twist that we don't often think about. And then as you move, as you mentioned, Central Kentucky and the Bluegrass is the most consistently heavily enslaved part of the state. The really fertile areas in and around Lexington are very heavily enslaved. The one Black majority county in Kentucky is Woodford County, Versailles. And then the Tobacco Belt in Western Kentucky. Hopkinsville and Christian County has an incredibly high enslaved population, and any of those tobacco counties will as well. And that tends to, slave owning generally correlates to Confederate support, but that is not to say that that all slave owners are Confederates by any means. Probably the majority of them are not.
Are there some resources and books you could recommend on sharecropping and on African-American farmers and their experiences in the Bluegrass state after emancipation?
Really fantastic question. We need more of that work being done. There are, let me think. There's a really great book on Hopkinsville called Been Coming Through the Storm So Long. I'm really tempted to turn around in my bookshelf right now that narrates this. There was also a really fantastic historian, he's not writing much anymore, named Christopher Waldrop, who did some absolutely stunning work, really, really detailed sort of demographic work on the transition from slavery to freedom, particularly in Western Kentucky. Some really stunning stuff there. Oh God, I'm trying to think. We've had Blaine Hudson, who was a professor forever at U of L and who's unfortunately passed away recently, did some really fantastic work on antebellum African American economics. I'm trying to think what we have after the war to narrate that. It's quite thin, and if we could have some more people pitching in on that, we would be the better off for it. One of the kind of the bigger themes that I would say is migration out of Kentucky pretty soon after the Civil War. People are trying to get out as they find that their labor contracts that they negotiate are either just incredibly unfair, right? All of the horrors of sharecropping that we know about from elsewhere in the Deep South, or as they find they're not honored, or they're being just driven off their land violently by the Klan and other groups. We start to see this movement. You can watch it in the 1870 census. Counties kind of in the southern part of the state are whitening as Black people are moving up to the central part of the state, and they stay there in this band around Lexington, Louisville, Mount Sterling, Paris for a few years, and then by 1880, then those people have moved north. They've gone north of the Ohio River, and they're now in Indianapolis, or they're in Columbus, or they're in Cincinnati, and eventually, then we'll see the kind of the Great Migration around the turn of the century and right after World War I that will push up into Chicago and Detroit and everywhere else. But Kentucky is one of the kind of early leaders in leaving and getting out. And in some cases, that's as organized communities. Kentucky is very famous, a part of the Exoduster movement, as entire Black communities, particularly in the bluegrass, kind of get fed up with it, and they pool their resources together that they've managed to scrape together, and entire communities will move out to places like Nebraska or Kansas or Minnesota, where there is increasing land available under the Homestead Act that the Republicans passed, increasingly sort of pushing Native Americans out of that land. And so you get these transplanted Black Kentucky communities that end up on the Western Plains. And there's some more work on that that needs to be done, because we need to know where all of those movements and passages happen.
Patrick, there is a recommendation of a book. It's called Been Coming Through Some Hard Times.
That was the one.
Race, History, and Memory in Western Kentucky, 2012, by Jack Glazer.
Jack Glazer, yes, absolutely. University of Tennessee Press. I could not think of the name of that one. Yes, excellent book.
Stone is making the recommendation. And then here's an interesting one from Ms. Becky Shaw. At one point, there were many all African-American cities and towns in Kansas and Oklahoma. Are the years after Juneteenth when those communities began to form? And I guess the same question would apply to some of the communities in not far from Madison, Indiana, or one in particular that was an African-American community. How did they originate, and then what happened to them?
Yeah, so that's a really fantastic question. Those tend not to be immediate post-emancipation communities. For the most part, we see this, we see in the immediate years following freedom, people trying to make a go of it here in Kentucky. And there is some hope, because when the Freedmen's Bureau is still active and is there to enforce fair labor contracts, and the U.S. Army is still present in Kentucky through the kind of mid-1870s in a kind of half-hearted way, there is still some hope that Kentucky can be a place where Black people can get a fair shake. And it becomes increasingly apparent over the course of the 1870s and into the 1880s that it's just not going to happen. And that's when you start to see that sort of organized exodus or movement happen. And you know, it's important to recognize that those communities that are able to go out to Nicodemus and other places are really wealthy and prosperous, right? Like these are communities that are able to, they own land that they're able to sell in Kentucky, and they're able to then go and buy land. And a lot of these communities are led by U.S. Army veterans. They are led by ministers. They are well educated. They had taken advantage of the educational opportunities that the Freedmen's Bureau had out there. And so these are really prosperous communities that are able to exodus and move en masse in that way. What we see, unfortunately, is more common is individual families and individuals getting fed up, right? And having one too many bad breaks go against them, and somebody took an exception to them in their county, and then they go off on their own. And so then we start to see, you know, places like the west end of Louisville, like the north end of Lexington, like Cincinnati, start to see their Black populations grow and grow and grow. And that's really this one-off and small movement of people who cannot make it in rural Kentucky and try and find more opportunities for themselves in the cities where there is, at least, and the advantage of coming to a city is there is an existing infrastructure of Black churches and businesses that's built on the backs of that antebellum free Black community that existed in places like Louisville, and can support these individuals when they do come in there. And you know, they of course end up in segregated sections of town. But on the one hand, that's an advantage because Klan's not coming into the segregated part of town. They know better, right? Like they're not going to try and do that. Whereas if you're isolated off and if you're sharecropping out somewhere in, I don't know, Garrett County or somewhere, you are in danger, right? When you are miles and miles away from anybody else, that's quite dangerous for you. So, yeah.
This is a question from historian Emily Bingham. I'm beginning a project on the expulsion of a group of Black families from Henry County in 1877. This was posed as an alternative to lynching. The families seem to have gone to Ohio and Indiana. How much do we know about the communities there?
Yeah, and I think probably, and this is just me wildly speculating, asterisk, not nearly enough. We don't know nearly enough. I would suggest that those that the communities of people that leave Kentucky in the 1870s, 1880s, and find their way into the states of the old Northwest. So not going out to the plains, but going out to Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. You know, they're finding pre-existing communities of people who have left slavery, right? So these states are dotted with antebellum communities of color that are, again, are segregated, and they're tight knit, and they're there, and they're often, you know, harassed by local state authorities, et cetera. But they exist there, and we know that there are connections between those communities and enslaved communities in Kentucky. Right. So as somebody goes and manages to escape and make their way north, you know, they get word back into Kentucky and say, hey, I'm here. And if anybody else can get out, you know, come to this part of Indiana because we have it pretty good here, all things considered. And so that then has these people don't migrate in a vacuum usually. They like to follow sort of pre-existing routes. And I would speculate that is what's happening there. I've got a good friend named Robert Murray, who's a native Woodford Countyan, who's doing some fantastic work on Black finance in antebellum Kentucky, and then persisting through slavery. And there was some really interesting things that he was able to find that link some sort of wealthy free people of color in antebellum Versailles to some communities in, I forget if it's Illinois or Indiana or Ohio, but somewhere up there. And there is this sort of constant communication that then is expanded upon in the years after slavery.
We promised people that we would be done in an hour. We've gone exactly an hour. It's been really mesmerizing. But I think we can, if anyone needs to leave, feel free to do so by just punching the leave button. However, We'll keep going for a few more minutes. And Patrick, I want to give you time to do what you know we in the legal profession during an oral argument call the reply. If you have one, but this is a question that is quite topical, but quite telling and interesting and important. And actually, there are two of them that tie in together. And that is, in the last week, we have seen the disappearance of, or the removal of the statue of Jefferson Davis from the Kentucky State Capitol. And the question, I think, is, how did these monuments crop up, the Confederate ones? And are there any Union monuments in the state that were put up after the war? And finally, with respect to Camp Nelson and other parks and monuments in the state, do you see any changes happening in the way they're presented? And maybe the most salient example is the Jefferson Davis Monument down in Fairview in Todd. I'm giving you a lot to work with there.
Yeah. Oh, I can roll on that for a little while. Book shout out, if you want a real deep dive into all of this, Ann Marshall, Creating a Confederate Kentucky, from North Carolina Press, probably about 2010, is an absolutely wonderful book by a native Lexingtonian that examines all of this. Essentially, Kentucky becomes more Confederate after the war is over. There's a very famous line that it waits till after 1865 to secede. Kentucky Confederates come back, and this is actually really interesting, with a game plan. And they mean to make themselves heard when they come back in to the state after the war. And so they pretty immediately form veterans organizations within the state that serve as proxy sort of political organizations as well. The Orphan Brigade, which is an infantry brigade of Confederate Kentuckians, publishes a unit history in 1867, which is earlier than anybody else in the Confederacy is putting out a unit history. And that's also because they've come back to a Kentucky which is relatively unscathed. You know, it ain't Georgia, it ain't Virginia, right? Like, things are pretty good here. Sherman didn't come through here and burn stuff. The L&N, in fact, made a lot of money off sending supplies to Sherman. So these veterans come back and they write this unit history, and more important than the kind of stuff when they talk about the battles that they fight, in the back is a directory of every soldier that served in the Orphan Brigade and what his mailing address is, and what battles he fought in. So if you are a Confederate veteran who's looking to get into politics, all you have to do is open up this phone book, and you've got a few hundred, probably 1,200, maybe 1,500 men that you know have your back. And have your vote. And so these veterans organizations expand into the United Confederate Veterans, and they start to hold pretty frequent reunions, really throughout the 1880s and 1890s, kind of a heyday of this. The corresponding Union Veterans Organization, is the Grand Army of the Republic, is never very popular in Kentucky because it is politically linked to the Republican Party nationally. The majority of Kentuckians were Democrats at that time, and so the GAR never gets much of a toehold outside of places like Louisville and city chapters in Lexington and Eastern Kentucky. There's some really strong Black chapters as well that serve as sort of nucleuses of Republican Party voting out in certain parts of the state. But eventually, as these veterans start to die off, and the reunions stop becoming as well attended, they start shifting to monumentation, right? When the soldiers aren't present anymore, you put the soldier on the pedestal. And that starts to happen around the 1890s and continues on through the 1920s. And that's kind of the heyday of the courthouse monument there, as they're trying to claim space and represent Confederate memory. there is an overwhelmingly and disproportionate number of Confederate monuments in this state as compared to Union monuments, especially when you consider the wartime demographics, where about 2/3 of the state's fighting men were in blue instead of gray. The most notable Union monument in the state is in Frankfort, and it's in the African American Cemetery just up the hill from Kentucky State. And it is a monument to Black soldiers from Kentucky who are buried there in that Frankfort Cemetery. And that's really important. I think the establishment of Camp Nelson and bringing that into the national park system is absolutely massive. And that represents this shift in us thinking about nationally, right? Thinking about what the Civil War means, right? We're not looking for a battlefield anymore. We're looking for a site of emancipation and freedom, and a story that involves families as much as it involves military-aged men there. The Jeff Davis Monument down in Fairview, I know you mentioned, is probably, it's one of the last Confederate monuments to go up in this heyday of monument building. They started right before World War I, and they had to halt construction because they run out of money, and they run out of labor because everybody's in the Army, and they finally get it put up a few years afterwards. But it's kind of this, it's a really interesting debate within the Confederate community about what we should do. The last remaining veterans want to build this thing that will challenge the Washington Monument in DC, right? It's an obelisk. It's the same idea. They don't want it to be as tall. They want to give their nod to Washington, but they want this grand thing. Problem is, nobody really liked Jeff Davis. Even within the Confederacy, it's try being the president of a republic founded on states' rights. Nobody is going to like you. And so it's in the middle of nowhere. I say this as a native Western Kentuckian. It's tough to get to. And they cannot raise money for this thing. And the Daughters of the Confederacy eventually come in and kind of save the bacon of these old veterans who had just completely tapped themselves out trying to raise money for it. And they sneak the thing over the finish line. The construction is awful. I mean, like seriously, go down there and look at the concrete work. It's wavy. It's dripping down. It's just they threw this thing together. It's a miracle the thing is still standing, regardless of politics. But the debate was, even among the UDC ladies, the Daughters of the Confederacy, why are we spending all of our money on this thing that people will have to travel to? What we should be doing is building monuments and courthouses where we can claim space in every county in the South, and we should be working on textbooks. And really the pivot by that time had shifted to textbooks, and they understood that they needed to win the minds of the next generation of Southern children, and to write textbooks that would present a favorable view of the Confederacy and of slavery. And those are the textbooks that they write, and they get adopted by state and local school boards. And those are going to be the ideas that rattle around in the minds of politicians in the South up to and through the era of civil rights. And so they had recognized that monuments were not quite doing the work that they needed to, but that there were more important things. And especially this 350-foot tall monstrosity in the middle of nowhere wasn't going to change anybody's mind about anything.
Last question. There were, preceding the abysmal 1850 Kentucky Constitution, in which additional pro-slavery provisions were put in, there were emancipation meetings across the state. The largest one was in Frankfort, and that Frankfort one evolved into, the participants agreed that emancipation needed to occur, but it ended up ineffectual because they couldn't agree on what emancipation would mean. What does that say to you about the movement and the types of emancipationists in play in Kentucky before the war?
This is a really fantastic question. And it gets to a lot of the ambiguity in Kentucky's history with slavery and race that extends well up until the present day. A lot of Kentuckians, a lot of white Kentuckians, usually who owned slaves and who were sort of politically well-read and sort of consider themselves intellectuals, followed the lead of the founding generation of kind of Washington and Jefferson, and decrying slavery in principle and philosophically, while continuing to practice the institution because it was profitable for them. And so you see sort of the leading figure for this in the state is Henry Clay, who's the president of the American Colonization Society, right, which is a group of people, slave owners and not, from all over the country, who believe that slavery should one day somehow be ended, and that somehow all of the people who were enslaved in the United States should be sent to Liberia. They got so far as to purchase land in Liberia to do so, but never quite got to a national solution. And so slave owners who considered themselves philanthropically minded would occasionally emancipate individuals and families, and then tell them that they had to go back to Africa when, you know, those people had been in, you know, their families had been in America for generations by that point. So in Kentucky and in other sort of border slave states, places like Maryland, these ideas are incredibly popular in the decades before the Civil War. And so this sort of comes to a head in the late 1840s. And people kind of see by the late 1840s, or really in the wake of the Mexican-American War, that the expansion of the country farther and farther west is going to create a crisis around the institution of slavery. That if we keep having Western territories and we keep having to carve up and decide which states will be slave states and which states will be free states, and we have to keep doing the math in Congress to make sure that the slave power and the free states are always balanced out so that slavery can continue to be protected, that this is going to be problematic. And so there's a push within Kentucky to write a new constitution, which they needed to do administratively for a number of other reasons. The way the courts were structured was just ridiculous. And Kentucky needed a new constitution because the old one had been written right at the turn of the 19th century. But the emancipationists really sort of push the question right now because they feel like they've got a moment that they can really exploit in this sort of national fear and this recognition of, ooh, I don't know that I've got a stomach for this fight for slavery in the territories for the next, you know, upcoming, you know, however many years. It ended up being about 10. And so they try and push this. And as you say, the Emancipation Party in Kentucky is this whole constellation of ideas about that range from out and out abolitionists who advocate for complete racial equality, and believe me, they are in the overwhelming minority. There are not very many of them. They tend to keep their mouths shut. To the more kind of common position is this very Jeffersonian one. We have the wolf by the ears, and you can't let go. We would love, they think, to get rid of slavery, but how? And they don't want to do anything unless there is compensation for them. They want the federal government to pay them for every enslaved person that they own so that they can cash out, essentially, and sort of come out economically ahead. They're not going to get rid of slavery if it hurts their pocketbooks. And then there is this question again that creates this other sort of constellation of opinion about what you do with enslaved people after they're free. Do you send them to Africa? Well, that's expensive. Who's going to pay for that? Do you send them to Indiana? You send them across the Ohio River? Indiana does not want that. None of these states, you know, the states north of the Ohio River have black exclusion laws. They tell black people you cannot come here. Do we fight more wars with the Indians to create some sort of black colony out in the West? That seems terrifying. That reminds us a lot of Haiti. We don't like that. So essentially they kind of agree that, yeah, somehow, some way emancipation would be fantastic, but we're not really sure what we can do with it. And so they put these ideas out there and they call this constitutional convention. They have this a series of meetings across the state to send these delegates to this convention in Frankfurt, where they hash out all these ideas and they realize they are not ready, but the ball's already rolling anyway. And so they go out and they try and elect delegates to this constitutional convention that the state is going to have in 1849. And they absolutely get trounced. You know, they realize that they are this small group of intellectuals and property owners and lawyers and ministers, and the vast majority of the state wants nothing to do with ending slavery. And so this overwhelmingly pro-slavery constitutional convention gets elected and produces this constitution in 1850, which is the strongest pro-slavery constitution in the South. It explicitly comes out and says, you know, slavery is a right and it shall not be abridged. And so that really does a pretty crippling blow to this kind of moderate anti-slavery cause in the state. And then the death of Henry Clay, you know, a few years after that in 1852, having narrowly avoided the Union falling apart over this exact question of what do you do with all of this territory that we won from Mexico in the war. You know, Clay having narrowly avoided that, then drops dead. And the Whig Party, which had kind of been the seat of this moderate anti-slaveriness, just completely falls apart. The Democratic Party, which is nationally linked with pro-slavery interests, rises up in Kentucky for the first time. And so secessionists are feeling, and this is quite ironic, secessionists are feeling pretty good going into the election of 1860 and the secession debates that follow. So yeah, and this is important too, because in later years, and I know I'm rambling on, in later years, people would look back at this emancipation movement in Kentucky and say, and look at their rhetoric, look at their words, but not their actions, and look at the fact that they held a convention, not that didn't get the majority of political support in the state, and in fact, it had very little political support throughout the state. And so they think that owners in Kentucky, slave owners in Kentucky, must have been nicer and kinder somehow, right? Like if people can see the injustice of slavery and want to find a way, eventually, somehow, some way, to end the institution, then they must have been somehow better masters on the ground. They must have been kinder and not beaten people as much, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, those two things just absolutely do not go together. And so the legacy of that emancipation movement is really to, I think, mask the depths of the harshness of slavery in Kentucky. And we really see that emerging in the ways that Kentucky treats free people after emancipation.
Patrick, I want to thank you so much for this presentation. I want to thank all of you who participated. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Dinsmore and Scholl, for making this possible, and the entire series this summer of Filson Fridays that we'll be doing. Now, again, you'll remember that Patrick and I, along with some folks at Dinsmore, looked at Juneteenth and decided that really what would be appropriate was for this lecture, this series of questions and answers to take place today on Juneteenth. And I am so glad that we did. What I'll be doing on July 17th on Madison Johnson is we'll jump off of what Patrick has been discussing with you today, because he was an emancipationist, but a conflicted emancipationist in some ways. And it will be interesting, I think, to see how one very, very smart, adroit human being dealt with the issue of slavery and emancipation in the maelstrom of the Civil War and the decades preceding. Thank you, Patrick. Excellent job. Bye, everybody. Oh, and for those of you who are interested, we had 183 people register for today's program, which is remarkable and meaningful, and I think a recognition of the importance of this day. Thank you.